On June 4th, 1942, 20 Brewster F-2A Buffaloes roared off the runway at Midway Island to meet an incoming wave of Japanese bombers. The Marines flying them knew it was going to be ugly. What they did not know was just how fast it would be over. The escorting Zeros fell on them before most pilots even had time to set up a shot. 13 Buffaloes were torn out of the sky in minutes. Of the 7 that made it back, only 2 were in any condition to fly again. Major Floyd Parks, the squadron commander, was shot down, bailed out over open water, and was strafed by Zeros while hanging in his parachute. The pilots who survived did not mince words. One wrote in his official report that any commander who sends a man into combat in an F-2A Buffalo should consider that pilot lost before he ever leaves the ground. After Midway, the Buffalo's reputation was finished. The military wanted nothing to do with it. Aviation historians would spend the next 80 years calling it one of the worst fighters of the entire war. Historians called it a death trap. The Americans called it a failure. In the frozen skies of the East, a handful of Finnish pilots were about to prove everyone wrong. They did not see a flying coffin, because to them, it was the pearl of the skies. Here is what almost none of them mention. While those Marines were dying over the Pacific, a warrant officer in the Finnish Air Force was sitting in the cockpit of the exact same basic aircraft, painting an orange number 4 on its fuselage and preparing to fly it into combat against the Soviet Union. His name was Ilmari Juutilainen. Over the next 3 years, in that plane, he would become something the aviation world had never seen before and has not seen since. To understand how that happened, you first have to understand how it was built.
You're watching World War II Air Command.
In the late 1930s, the U.S. Navy was looking to move beyond biplanes. They issued a requirement for a modern carrier fighter, all metal, with an enclosed cockpit and retractable landing gear. The Brewster XF-2A1 won the competition. For the time, it looked genuinely impressive on paper. It was compact, it was fast enough to be competitive, and it introduced technology most Navy pilots had never flown before. The problem came as the Navy started actually using it. Carrier operations demand a lot from an airframe. You need heavy gear for arrested landings, flotation equipment for water ditching, armor to protect the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks to reduce fire risk. The Navy kept adding all of it. With each upgrade from the F-2A1 to the F-2A2 to the F-2A3, the Buffalo got heavier. By the time the Marines took it to Midway, the F-2A3 weighed roughly 600 pounds more than the original design was ever intended to carry. The engine never changed to compensate. The result was a plane that handled like a truck, climbed like it was dragging an anchor, and could not get out of its own way when a Zero came calling. In the Pacific heat, the Wright Cyclone engine overheated constantly. In combat, the plane could not match the Zero's climb rate, could not match its turn radius, and could not run away from it either. It had no real ceiling for escape and no speed advantage to break contact. Pilots were essentially being asked to win a knife fight while wearing a straitjacket. The Midway disaster sealed the verdict. The Buffalo was done in American service. Most military historians nodded along and moved on. Nobody paid much attention to what was happening in Finland. In early 1940, with the Soviet Union massing forces on its border, Finland was in desperate need of modern fighter aircraft. The Finnish government reached out to the United States and managed to acquire 44 examples of the Brewster Model B-239, an export version of the same basic airframe. Critically, these were denavalized aircraft. The heavy carrier equipment, the tailhooks, the flotation gear, all of it was stripped out before delivery. The Finns also removed the self-sealing fuel tanks and the pilot armor, accepting that risk in exchange for the performance gain. The resulting airplane weighed around 600 pounds less than the F-2A3 that Marines flew at Midway. That difference was not cosmetic. It changed the fundamental character of the machine. Finnish ground crews then went to work on what was left. The Wright Cyclone engine had a well-known reliability problem, and the Finns found the fix by accident through systematic experimentation. They discovered that inverting one piston ring in each cylinder solved the engine's tendency to foul and seize. It was an unglamorous solution, but it worked. The overheating problems that plagued the Pacific theater never materialized in the cold Nordic climate, and with the piston ring modification, reliability improved dramatically. The Finnish mechanics also kept serviceability rates unusually high despite the brutal winters. Aircraft that might have sat grounded for days in other air forces were back in the air within hours. In a small country fighting a much larger enemy, every available fighter mattered. The result of all these changes was an airplane that Finnish pilots genuinely liked. Ilmari Juutilainen, who was about to find out exactly what this plane could do in the right hands, described the B-239 as a gentleman's touring plane. Finnish pilots gave it a nickname, Taivaan Helmi, Pearl of the Skies. Ilmari Juutilainen was born in 1914 in Lieksa, a small town in eastern Finland. He joined the Finnish Air Force in 1935, and by the time the Winter War broke out in 1939, he was already a combat pilot flying the Fokker D-21. He scored his first kill on December 19, 1939, a Soviet DB-3 bomber. By the end of the Winter War, he had 3 confirmed kills and over 100 sorties in his logbook. When the Continuation War began on June 25, 1941, Juutilainen was assigned to 3rd of LELV-24, the Finnish Air Force's primary Buffalo unit. He was handed a B-239 and told to go to war with it. On July 9, 1941, less than 2 weeks into the new war, Juutilainen shot down 2 Soviet Polikarpov I-153 biplane fighters on a single sortie. He was now officially an ace in the Buffalo. He would not stop there. Over the following months, Juutilainen developed a reputation for pressing attacks to extreme close range, often closing to within 50 meters before firing. At that distance, even a mediocre burst was lethal. He calculated that the risk of being spotted and reacted to at such short range was worth the certainty of a clean kill. It was a method that required nerve most pilots simply did not have. His aircraft, BW-364, carried a hand-painted orange 4 on its fuselage and became one of the most dangerous fighter airframes in the history of aerial warfare. Juutilainen scored 28 of his 34 Buffalo kills specifically in that aircraft between July 1941 and November 1942, including multiple triple kills and single sorties. On February 6, 1942, he intercepted a Soviet formation of Tupolev SB bombers, escorted by MiG-3 fighters, and brought down 2 bombers and a fighter in a single engagement. He was operating at altitudes and in conditions that neutralized Soviet numerical advantage and turned the Buffalo's tight turn radius into a decisive weapon. BW-364 was later determined to have achieved 42.5 confirmed kills across all the pilots who flew it. That figure, if accurate, makes it possibly the highest-scoring individual fighter airframe in the history of air warfare. Juutilainen alone was responsible for the majority of them. He refused a commission to officer rank throughout the war because he feared a promotion would take him out of the cockpit. He flew and fought as a warrant officer by choice. Juutilainen was not the only reason the Finnish Buffalo excelled. The tactics built around it were equally important. Lentoleivu 24 operated using a 4-plane formation the Finns called the parvi, which translates loosely as swarm. The structure was straightforward. A lower pair flew as bait, making themselves visible to Soviet formations and drawing pursuit. A higher pair sat above and behind, watching. When Soviet aircraft committed to the chase, the upper pair dove in from altitude with speed and gravity on their side, hitting before the Soviets knew anyone was above them. The Soviet Air Force never found a reliable counter to it. Soviet doctrine at the time relied heavily on rigid 3-plane formations and prescribed engagement patterns that made their pilots predictable. Finnish pilots, many of whom had been in combat since the Winter War, had spent 2 years studying exactly how Soviet formations operated and where their weaknesses were. They knew which aircraft types could be baited, which escorts could be separated from their charges, and which angles of attack the Soviets were least likely to cover. The geographic and climatic factors reinforced all of it. The low-altitude combat that dominated the Eastern Front played directly to the Buffalo's strengths. The B-239 was never a high-altitude interceptor, but below 15,000 feet, with its weight kept down and its engine running clean in the Finnish cold, it turned and climbed well enough to outmaneuver most of what the Soviets were fielding in 1941 and 1942. The results across the entire squadron were historic. Lentoleivu 24, flying the Buffalo from June 1941 through the end of its service life, claimed 477 confirmed aerial victories against Soviet aircraft. Their combat losses in the Buffalo numbered 19 aircraft. That is a kill ratio of roughly 25-1. To put that number in context, the legendary F-4U Corsair, one of the finest fighters America ever built, achieved a kill ratio of approximately 11-1. The Buffalo, in Finnish hands, more than doubled it. So here's the question that has been hanging in the air since the beginning. How does the same airplane become both the worst fighter of the war and one of the most lethal? The answer is that it was never really the same airplane at all. The Buffalo that died at Midway was the F-2A3, overloaded with carrier equipment, running a maxed-out engine in tropical heat, flown by pilots who had trained in peacetime and were handed an inadequate machine to fight the finest carrier fighter Japan ever built. The Buffalo that Utalainen flew into combat in BW-364 was something else entirely. It was running in conditions that suited the engine. It was maintained by mechanics who had solved the reliability problems from scratch. It was flown by a man who had already been in 2 wars, who knew exactly where to place his shots, and who understood how to use the plane's turn radius as a weapon. It was flown inside a tactical system designed specifically to exploit its strengths and cover its weaknesses. Aviation history has a habit of judging aircraft by their worst performance. The Buffalo earned that judgment at Midway, and it was deserved. The full story, though, is the story of 2 different wars, 2 different climates, 2 different sets of mechanics, and one extraordinary Finnish warrant officer who looked at a plane everyone else had written off and saw something worth fighting in. Utalainen went on to score 94 confirmed kills before the war ended, making him the highest-scoring non-German ace in recorded history. 58 of those kills came in a Messerschmitt Bf-109G after he was transferred to a new unit. His 34 kills in the Buffalo, the majority of them in a single airframe marked with an orange 4, remain among the most remarkable individual combat records of the entire war. He refused decorations he felt he had not earned. He flew 437 sorties without a single hit to his aircraft from an enemy fighter. After the war, he worked as a civilian pilot, took his last flight at the age of 83, and died peacefully at home in 1999 on his 85th birthday. The plane they called a flying coffin outlasted every expectation anyone had for it, because the right man, in the right conditions, with the right mechanics, found something in it that the engineers and the admirals and the history books missed completely.